I'm super pleased to welcome you. My name is Colin Orians. I'm the Director of the Environmental Studies Programs at Tufts University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture today. This series is brought to you through the generous donations of Tufts alumni Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke. We always start with a few announcements, and so I am going to make a few announcements. If you are interested in learning more about the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series, you can sign up through a link that we're going to put in the chat. And similarly, if you are a student and you're interested in learning more about opportunities at Tufts and jobs and internships, the second link that I'm putting in the chat could be for you. So at this link, you can sign up for this as well. So, okay, so there is also one more announcement that I want to make. Tomorrow, we're having an environmental brunch. So this is an opportunity for you to get to know more about environmental programming across the entire university. And if you are interested in that environmental brunch, we'll be putting that also in the chat momentarily. I just want to go over a few logistics of today's lecture. The chat is disactivated. So what we'll hope you'll do is you put your questions in the question answer box, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. We're going to have this as a dialogue, a conversation between our guest speaker and myself, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you, the audience. So the meeting will be recorded and we will put it on our website later. So one of my pleasures as Director of Environmental Studies is to welcome environmental alumni, Tufts University alumni back to Tufts, even if it has to be virtually. And today we're blessed with Rosanna Xia, who is coming to us from LA. Good morning to you. Rosanna and others who are alumni, I've always just been amazed at their generosity and in the many ways in which they've helped our program grow and participate in workshops, give guest lectures, teach courses, provided funding for this series. Thank you for coming. So Rosanna graduated from Tufts in 2011, and she did a lot when she was here. She majored in international relations, quantitative economics. She minored in communications and media studies, and I noted she was captain of the track team. So you were very busy as an undergrad. Since leaving Tufts, she's landed at the LA Times, where she is a staff reporter, and she covers coastal issues, which includes everything from environmental justice to sea level rise to extinction and many other topics. And we'll talk about some of those today. One of the things as I read her stories, I'm super inspired by your ability to connect to the personal lives of your readers. It's clear you think about how to make the stories really relevant. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for work that she did on sea level rise, and she'll talk a little bit about this. Rosanna, it's great to have you back virtually to Tufts.
Yeah, happy to be here and to talk about environmental issues.
Thank you. So as a way of introducing yourself maybe more, can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up from majoring in IR and quantitative economics to the LA Times as a reporter?
Yeah, so classic Tufts, or I guess some people at Tufts, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but with an IR quant econ double major, I ended up doing an internship internationally at a big venture capital firm, and it just wasn't for me. So, I came back, it was my junior year, I started looking into the CMS minor, I talked to Julie Dobrow, and I ended up applying to like 13 different internships in different sectors and just hoping the universe will tell me, this is it for you. And I ended up landing a really cool summer gig at the LA Times on their copy desk. So a lot of proofreading, fact checking. The copy desk is basically the last set of eyes before, the article goes to the printer. And, I ended up realizing I loved words, I love facts, I love translating complicated issues into plain English for people. And, luckily the LA Times gave me a shot at being a reporter. So I ended up, at the beginning, just doing all the crazy breaking news shifts at all hours of the day and night, and just saying yes to every single assignment until I landed on the environment team.
Wow, that's wonderful. And what part of your education at Tufts do you think most prepared you? It sounds like you cast a wide net, but you had lots of mentors or class experiences or internships.
Yeah, so so many things. I eventually in the newsroom became known as the reporter with a quant econ degree who wasn't afraid of numbers, who wasn't afraid of reading a 400-page science or policy report on deadline and then summarizing it into a 1,000-word article by 4 p.m. in the same day. And, I've covered droughts, wildfires, earthquakes, mudslides, all of the things that, make you wonder why we even built California, and kind of translating science into policy and really bridging these worlds, which I think Tufts really prepares you well for. And it sounds silly, but some of the toughest courses at Tufts made me really good at this, reading a ton of studies last minute and then cramming super fast and then writing very quickly something that is smart and thoughtful and interesting that advances the conversation on this topic. Like, that's what Tufts teaches you to do. And, Tufts really gives you a well-rounded understanding of how to think critically about the world. And that really helped me in so many ways. And I should definitely mention, I think, and I hope students really feel this as they graduate, the Tufts connection is the gift that keeps on giving when I least expect it. So the video game that we made for the Sea Level Rise project, so I have no idea how to make a video game, quant econ IR word person, but I knew that I had this idea with my editor that a video game would be a super powerful way to unpack a complicated climate change issue that we were stuck on. And it happened that Terry Castleman, who graduated in 2016, was a CS major at the engineering school and also a double econ major at Arts and Sciences. He had recently joined the LA Times as a computer engineer on the app development side. But because we both went to Tufts, we somehow heard through the grapevine in the newsroom, we were like, hey, let's go get coffee. And as we were talking, I was like, oh my God, can you help me with this project? And he did, and it was incredible.
What a great experience. So you cover coastal issues writ large, and you mentioned. So how did you end up in the sort of area of coastal issues? Obviously, they're super complex, so I could see why you have to sort of distill all of this information from all of these different stakeholders. And so maybe you were just perfectly positioned to do that. So how did you end up in the coastal team?
Yeah, I love my beat. It's also like such a California beat, right? To cover the entire California coast and just be by the ocean all the time. But, I think I'm really proud of the environment team at the Los Angeles Times. So when you look at different newsrooms across the country, you'll see there are different approaches to covering climate and the environment, climate change and the environment. So at the New York Times, for example, they call their environment team the climate desk. Everyone there is a climate change reporter with sub beats in different worlds. At the LA Times, we don't have a climate change reporter. We have a coastal reporter. We have an air pollution reporter. We have a water reporter. We have a wildfire reporter. We have a public lands, high desert, kind of just like everywhere from Joshua Tree into the Sierras reporter. We have an energy reporter on the business desk and a reporter based in DC covering the EPA and all the stuff coming out of the White House. And we also have an investigative reporter who roams around everywhere. She did an incredible project last year actually on the Marshall Islands, which, if you think about the way our newsrooms are set up, no one's really thinking to go to the Marshall Islands to do a story, but she, did this incredible investigation on how basically the US offloaded all our nuclear waste decades ago to the Marshall Islands, and it's now in this like old cracking dome floating out there in the ocean. And if sea level rise and climate change cracks this dome, we are all screwed because we all share this one ocean, and there's all this radioactive waste kind of just in this dome. So, long-winded answer of saying there are a lot of different ways to cut the environment coverage, and I had always wanted to be on the environment team. And there was an opening a couple years ago on the coastal range. So I was like, I really want to do this. And it's a great beat. Environment coverage does, you have to be good at science, you have to be fluent in politics and policy and translating really complicated issues into engaging stories, right? And that are people-based, that are community-based. So all of these things were things that I had really collected along my way at the LA Times, and it really was something that felt like a good fit for me.
So if we could loop back then to the specific story that led to the Pulitzer Prize nomination, you figured out a way to connect to people. You figured out a way to make it visual. You figured out a way to sort of tell a complex story. Can you tell us a little bit about the story itself and sort of what you were trying to accomplish in that, and the way and why you think it was recognized as being such a great piece?
Yeah, thank you. It was a beast of a project, but I'm really happy with how it came out. I mean, with the project, I think like when we talk about climate change, we often don't, we as in the universal we don't differentiate between mitigation and adaptation. And they're both critical, but the issue can feel really overwhelming when we're kind of just jumbling both mitigation and adaptation together. So my project was a conscious decision to focus on adaptation, which I feel like the project ran last year, but I think at this point we were talking a little bit more about adaptation. But with this article, we didn't indulge at all in the back and forth of what is causing sea level rise. Is sea level rise, is the sea actually rising? How do you curb emissions and save the ocean from overheating? Like none of that got explored in this piece. We just started with the premise that the sea is rising. We have a lot of tough choices to make on what we choose to save and what we have to let go. And this is something that California really should think about sooner than later, because the longer we wait, the more we stand to lose. And so the video game itself was a new way of putting readers in the hot seat and having them understand the costs and trade-offs of these tough decisions. I don't think, we often talk about these, when we talk about adaptation, a lot of these things feel abstract, right? Or you can easily get mad at a city leader or a state leader or a scientist or a politician telling you what these choices are. But then when you have to make these decisions with finite amounts of money, with different people yelling at you with different priorities, I think it was a really effective way of having people, readers, really understand why these choices are difficult and that all of them come with costs and sacrifices and you have to choose one. And so the game was really, I think, powerful in that way. And then the story itself, it was told with authority, but also with empathy. I really heard that from a lot of people after the article ran. I really spent time up and down the California coast, which is, 1,200 miles. It's the length of like Boston to Georgia. I went to different cities. Each place is a little bit different. I spent time getting to know people, their values, their motives, and just unpacking all of our emotional attachments to home and place and the desire to stick with what's comfortable and not change. So yeah, I think, all these things. And I'd also say, another thing that's really complex about climate change that the story tried to tackle was it tried to challenge our sense of time and how much time we actually have. Sea level rise is often described as a slow moving disaster that is not as dramatic as a lot of the other issues of climate change that makes the news. And you can't stand on the beach for one afternoon and really feel the sea rising and feel this disaster happening. So how do you make people realize that they are running out of time and that they have to act now?
So climate change, you kind of hinted at it, can be very polarized. So you focus on adaptation. How have you as a writer been able to sort of try to get beyond the polarization around climate and to your readers? And so, it sounds like going up and down the coast and talking to people was really important. Are there other keys to sort of trying to get beyond the polarization around climate?
Yeah, I personally think like getting as specific as possible, right? So with like the environment team breakdown, none of us are climate change reporters. We're thinking about how climate change impacts the worlds that we cover. With our water reporter, she's writing about droughts, right? With our air pollution reporter, he's writing about emissions, or it's clean energy as the energy reporter, and I'm writing about sea level rise. But I think, really the words themselves, climate change, like I'd be curious to hear what you think. There's this really lively debate in our industry right now about whether or not to call it climate change or a climate crisis. You know, there was
Right.
this movement spearheaded by The Guardian about a year or two ago. Just they're calling it what they think what it is, a climate crisis, and there is a lot of news organizations that have joined them. There are also a lot of newsrooms in this country in different states where the words climate change alienate their readers, and it's going to trigger something, and it's like there's just this wall that immediately goes up. So, you know, as communicators, are we preaching to the choir, or are we engaging new readers? Are we educating new people on this issue? Do we allow readers to arrive at their own conclusion that this is a crisis after we give them facts and really deeply reported stories? Or do we tell them up front that it is a crisis and that, you know, this is something we need to worry about? So I think I'm all over the place on this debate, but I would say that I have found it most effective when I'm not telling you this is a climate change story. I'm telling you this is a sea level rise story, and anyone who wants to still have a beach to go to 50 years from now, or a home or a road that, you know, you rely on getting from point A to point B every day, if you still want that to be here, or other critical infrastructure, or an airport that you fly into to see your mom, like these are things that are important that you should think about. And I think just getting the more specific and the more granular you get about these issues, and the more it's not just about climate change, the word that is now so politicized, right? Like, I think, I mean, climate change was a rebrand from the word global warming. You know, a couple years, it was what, like a decade ago, when a Republican in Congress during the polar vortex was like, this isn't global warming. So everyone was like, oh God, we have to like reframe this. But we haven't really figured out how to communicate this crisis, right, in a way that really engages everyone.
Well, words really matter. And I remember talking to someone who works in Texas, and they were saying that you need to have region specific language. So climate change doesn't work very well in Texas, but you can talk about extreme heat and sort of and
Mm-hmm.
have it have an effect. And I'm wondering, you know, California is long and big. It goes from the north all the way to the south. Do you find that there are certain ways in which your reporting is trying to reflect that entire state? And do you have to be mindful of differences across the sort of California culture?
Yeah, I mean, along the coast, it's a little like, you know, there's more of an inland coastal divide. But along the coast, I would say, you know, when I was reporting the sea level rise story, I don't think a single person I talked to said, I don't believe in climate change. You know, everyone believes in climate change. Yes, the sea is rising. You know, I drive a Prius and I recycle all the time. Like, those are coastal Californians. But then when it's about the argument really is about time. Do we have 20 years to adapt, or do we have 100 years to adapt? Is this something that I have to worry about, or is this something I don't have to, my grandchildren will have to worry about, and I'm just going to keep my home and have my way of life for the rest of my life? And I think being mindful of that, I think, is really important. And then, you know, what was also powerful about this piece was that the project kind of strung together the entire big picture of what was going on in California, because there was this point about 2 years ago where I felt like I could have written a daily, like a news story at every city. You know, 30, 40 cities were all having these existential conversations. They're all a little bit different, and they had their own flavors and based on the community and whoever was the loudest in that community. But instead of writing 30 dailies with the same nut graph, but just different people in different place, it's like, okay, let's stop and not write 30 of the same-ish stories and figure out what the bigger story is about California. Because also, I think the state's going to have to ultimately lead us on a lot of these things, and at some point, the nation. So I think acknowledging that there's no one-size-fits-all solution that we're trying to force down people's throats, but also acknowledging that every community is going to be different. Every community has different topographies. Some beach cities have cliffs that they have to worry about, and others are, you know, situated on top of an old lagoon. They're going to have to come up with very different adaptation strategies.
That's really interesting. You deal with complexity and you make it personal, and you were saying how you struggle to sort of make it not about one city, but, you know, sort of have it resonate across the whole coast despite its diversity. I've had, a lot of scientists want to just say, if we can just give you the facts, people will change minds. And it seems to me that you're like super interested in the facts. You're interested in changing minds, but you think there's more than just giving them the facts. And so I was wondering, how did you come to sort of take this very personal approach to sort of your reporting and trying to sort of meld personal stories with the sort of the factual understanding that you've come to have around sea level rise and its impacts on the coast?
Yeah, I mean, that's just such an interesting point. I think it's like finding people too that are relatable, right? I think I before my article, when I was doing my research, a lot of the stories about sea level rise in California was about the super rich homeowner in Malibu who wants to keep their 50 million, $30 million mansion by the sea, right? So I was like, I'm not going to, I talked to those people, but that's not going to be the main character in my story. It was the woman who had spent her entire life saving money to buy the ugliest house on the prettiest street in town with an oceanfront view, and then the moment she bought it at the last recession, and finally got her beachside dream, and then was told that actually this house might be underwater in 10-20 years, and actually the property value is going to tank the minute the city decides to red zone it, right? And so I think that's an emotional story that connects with a lot more of us than the $30 million homeowner in Malibu. I mean, they're all part of the conversation, but figuring out how you tell these stories is really important. And I think what you just said with, if we just gave people the data, they would know what to do. I think I've talked to so many engineers at this point, like coastal engineers, who say that they thought it was just an engineering problem. You lay out all of the facts, you look at the pros and cons and the cost benefit analysis, and then it's like, duh, we do this, right? But I think so many of them have told me after getting screamed at in city council meetings that it's a social issue. And I think it's a story, it's an issue about what we prioritize as a community and what we're willing to spend money on and what we're willing to sacrifice. And it kind of reminds me too. So we did the survey of our readers 2 years ago of like, what do you want the LA Times to cover? Like, what issues are important to you? And everyone was like, environment, like climate change and homelessness, right? And then when we write these stories, we look at the numbers and no one's clicking on these stories. It's like they want coverage of these really intense issues of such magnitude, but then they get overwhelmed. Like, I think climate change and homelessness, that was when I was like, yeah, they're similar in a lot of ways, in the sense that the issue is so big that like you individually feel like recycling one water bottle or giving $1 to the person that you see by the subway station is not going to change this problem. So I think recognizing too that like our readers feel powerless at times, and that this issue is systemic in some ways, that how do you unpack these stories so that people are still engaged and feel empowered and still care and feel like they can do something.
Thus your focus on adaptation. What can we do?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was reading your article in August about environmental justice in north of San Francisco, and I thought it was super interesting to think about how sea level rise and environmental justice kind of connected. And I was wondering if you would like to just spend a minute or so talking about sort of that connection between environmental justice and sea level rise.
Yeah, so I mean, that article was so interesting to me too. So it's like, it was a big study that came out from the USGS about a month ago. But basically the idea that, sea level rise, when we think about sea level rise, we think of water crashing over seawalls and flooding homes right on the coast, which tend to be higher real estate in California. I know it's different in, Louisiana and other states along the Atlantic. But when the sea rises and the ocean moves inland, you also have to think of the groundwater tables and how the sea, so basically fresh water tends to float on top of salt water. The ocean will move in and it will push the groundwater up. And then all these towns that are, they can see the ocean maybe, but they're further inland, or they're built on former swamps that were filled in to turn into land, or, former industrial areas. All that groundwater will eventually break the surface and cause flooding and remobilize all of this like gunk that we have from runoff, and if you're on a former industrial site, all these pollutants, and there's all these issues that flooding issues that would happen in these communities that tend to be less wealthy, that tend to be overlooked in these conversations about sea level rise, because we're looking at traditional flood maps that say if sea level rises 1 foot, the water will move in this much, and it's going to be this neighborhood along the coast that's going to be impacted. So let's talk about adaptation for these communities rather than the communities further inland that also need to worry about this and also have like larger contamination issues that, that seawalls and other defense mechanisms won't protect them from this groundwater issue. And so, it was, I think all of my coworkers and I, when we're thinking about these issues within our own worlds, our own beats, we're trying to think too, like, who is getting left out of this conversation? And as we talk about adaptation and mitigation too, I mean, our system, in reality, our society is, built on this idea that there will be winners and losers. And, how do we make sure, as we're talking about making sure that everyone has clean water in the future and places to live that are not, going to be 150 degrees in the future, like, how do we make sure everyone is in this conversation? How do we make sure we're not just listening to the people who are the loudest or who are the most affluent or who are the most kind of polished in their campaigns? And I think there is this greater awareness now that we need to be actively looking and not just listening. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
That's great. So that USGS story, so was that something that someone alerted you to that study? Was it something that you found? Was it like how do you find these stories that you end up saying this is actually a great way to think about the challenges and the opportunities to try to address them and get people to think about them? Because that's like an oh wow story that when I read it, it's like I had never thought of that, even though I'm a scientist.
So newsflash to every scientist listening, there are reporters like me who will crash science conferences, who will listen to presentations of unpublished research and then like go after you and ask you when that study is going to publish. So I had known that this groundwater study was going on for a couple of years because I've heard the lead author mention it during a keynote talk at some science conference a couple of years ago. I've seen poster board presentations from the postdoc. Like, it just, I knew this was a concept, but I also knew that, like, I'm on your side. I'm not going to write this article about this issue until you're ready, until the science is done and you're ready to present it. But also recognizing that the science takes sometimes years and the peer review could take forever. And, everything might be underwater by the time this report comes out and nature accepts it. There's like, so it's a constant source building dance of translating my world with their world, but also empathizing with their world. So with that groundwater story, like, I mean, that study was huge. It mapped and assessed the entire state of California for the first time on the groundwater sea level rise nexus, and, identified hotspots in cities that were going to have to think about this. And it was just a constant communication with the scientists and taking the time to understand the issue with the science team ahead of time, and then really, asking them, what are some communities that would be worth deep diving into? What is my lead example? Because I'm not going to just do a story that says a new study on Monday found blah, 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 blah. It's like, let's find people and places to tell these stories out of, and like, why should people care? And so luckily I had time to build that story out, because oftentimes as science reporters, Nature will say, okay, these are the articles that are going to be published in next issue. We'll tell you these are the studies, and the reporters have Friday from 3 p.m. to Sunday to read it, and the scientists have like 1 day on the embargo to talk to reporters, to translate and explain their studies to them. So building these source relations ahead of time is really important. But also building trust with, the scientists had to trust me to know that I wasn't going to scoop them on their own work.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I want to spend 10 minutes before we open it up for questions, sort of thinking about you mentioned at the beginning, California is going to be wrestling with these issues. They're often viewed as a leader in the country. And I was just reading this morning that the governor has signed a declaration that gas cars will not be sold after
2035.
2035. So
15 years from now.
15 years from now. So there, can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in California that you're seeing that is kind of around this adaptation, ways in which, that's a more of a mitigation kind of strategy, but could you talk a little bit about what is piquing your imagination, giving you some hope in what you're seeing in California?
Ooh, you're asking a journalist to talk about good news. Actually, this just reminds me, am I allowed, can I send things in the chat? I'm going to, so talking about kind of climate change versus climate crisis, the wildfires in the last month have been such a wake-up call. So I just sent you guys a photo that I tweeted of a front page last Sunday where the banner headline was California's climate apocalypse. Like our copy desk, who are the most stringent word guardians of the paper, allowed the words climate apocalypse to be on the front page of the paper. And I think that was a huge shift in how California is feeling about climate change. And Gavin Newsom, our governor, is definitely feeling the heat. But, I would say that there are still tough questions we need to ask and figure out. I think even with the announcement with the zero emissions car sales yesterday, there was left kind of in the fine print was, he still wasn't ready to commit on banning fracking. And a groundbreaking plastics bill that would have basically reduced dramatically source reduction of plastics, died at the last hour this year of our legislative session. And it was a bill that had died last year as well, with a lot of politicking on the Democratic side. And our economy in California still relies on oil a lot more than it looks. So, in terms of hope, I mean, the University of California, like that public massive research system in our state, has officially disinvested from fossil fuels this year. That's, I think, a really important sign. I would say California is really pushing clean energy targets and starting to really look at tough questions like, do we continue to let people rebuild in places that will continue to burn or be underwater in a few decades? Do we continue expanding development in high desert areas that have no natural source of water and continues to drain resources from elsewhere, that where elsewhere is also losing their fresh water? And just this idea of finite resources, like there is a lot of great talk happening in California that should inspire other states, but I really think it's about, we still have a lot of walking to do. And I think as a journalist, I'm like zeroing in on the governor in Sacramento and all our state leaders on like whether or not they're actually walking the walk.
So you feel like as a reporter, you can report and you can pressure through your writing.
I mean, I think we can call out empty promises or call out promises that were made on the record that never followed through a year or two from now. I think we can easily track where donations are coming in. And there's this term oily Democrats that floats around in Sacramento a lot. But I also think, as journalists, we are the people who bridge ideas. Like, I think it's, so many times I've run into a scientist up in the Bay Area who's working on this really important issue and he or she had no idea that someone down at UCLA was working on the same issue, except in Southern California. And then by writing an article that brings their two expertise together, and then to present it to people who are decision makers, read this and be like, oh my God, this is an issue that scientists in Northern California are worrying about, and Southern California, and here's the big statewide picture. When we're seeing it for the first time, let's introduce some legislation or let's talk about solutions. And I think our job really is to connect all the dots that are often siloed in academia and policy and advocacy. And oftentimes too, like a lot of advocacy groups might not realize, I think the network in California is pretty strong on the ocean front, but like I'm the one that's going to tell someone in California that Georgia is also working on this kind of bill that might be actually interesting for you guys to like link up. So I think it's really cool that we are able to kind of dabble and connect dots across the state and country.
The word silo has come up a lot today, and I just love this notion of a reporter is like breaking silos, connecting dots, bringing people together. We undoubtedly have some members of our audience today who might be thinking about a career in environmental reporting, and I was wondering if you could have some advice for them.
Awesome. And this is a growing field. I feel like any newsroom right now that is expanding and hiring I think environment is one of the big fields. I think that it is loud and clear people want more stories on climate and the environment. A big thing, that I wish people told me at Tufts when I was looking into journalism, building your writing clips is really important. So, whether it's through the Tufts Daily or the Observer or any other publication, just, start writing and start having publishable clips to show people that you want to write for. That's how you get more writing assignments. And then I guess when you're looking for topics to write about, I think we have a lot of reporters who in the world across the country that write about the melting glaciers and kind of the big climate change topics, but not enough people who are writing specifically about the water in Medford, for example, or how specific communities along the Gulf Coast or Georgia or the Dakotas, or any other kind of like these smaller communities, and how environmental change is impacting their communities. So think about these underreported communities and these underreported issues, and then find a home for these stories. And that is another great way to build clips that are, impactful, that will move the conversation forward. Yeah, and I would say there's also, I think, with an environmental studies, like a science background too, like there's a lot of great environmental writing happening in less obvious places. I feel like every big research university has a team of science writers writing for the university magazine, or there are a lot of great trade publications that are super specific. Like I read Shore and Beach, which is basically a magazine that talks about beach and coastal issues. Advocacy groups have been partnering up with podcasting people and documentary filmmakers. Like there's a lot of really cool work happening in that space too. So, think beyond the traditional ideas of journalism to find ways to have your voice heard and to help tell these stories. And if you're not part of the Society of Environmental Journalists, SEJ, like they're great. I think they have student resources too, and a student membership fee, but they have toolkits. It's just a great way to get a pulse of all the big environmental stories happening across the country, and also the smaller local newsrooms. And they also post fellowships and stuff like that. So SEJ is definitely a place to check out. I can also Slack that.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I do want to give our opportunity to sort of ask questions. So I'm going to read some questions from what people have posted, and I'm not going to necessarily do it in the order, because I want to try to put them together and make them follow each other. So Cliff Barger writes, the reporting you and your colleagues do at the Times seems impactful for helping reach people. At a more emotional level, do you have thoughts on how we can translate it into actual policy change? On environment and housing, we've seen a failure of leadership in the Sacramento time and again.
So, sorry, I was typing the SEJ. So looking at housing and.
So it's basically
Sorry,
saying.
Cliff. Hi, Cliff.
So if you press the question answer button, you can also read it at the bottom of your screen. The reporting you and your colleagues do at the Times reach people at emotional level. How can we translate that to policy change? And specifically, Cliff's talking about Sacramento, when oftentimes it seems to stall.
Yeah. So it's great to hear from Cliff, and he is a great LA Times supporter. So, and Tufts alum. I would say that. So I often think about how the polar bear used to be the poster child of climate change and human environmental destruction, right? And so I think it's like, and I'm constantly asking myself, what is the new poster child that will really just like tug at kind of our emotional heartstrings and also our desire to act now? And it's the people of Flint and the lead in their water now. It's, the wildfires burning in California. Like, look at how quickly Gavin Newsom talked the talk and moved on a bunch of executive orders when he saw so much of California burning. So I think on environment and housing, yeah, I think it's finding that poster child, whether it is a community where you can really tangibly translate, how some policy would help them, or finding one person and take, when in journalism we say that like the more specific you are, the more universal it is. And so finding that one person and telling their story from start to finish with like intense specificity. Like you read I'm just Eli Saslow at the Washington Post, his byline just popped up in my head. He has an incredible way of writing about the human experience where he's telling you exactly like this person is living on $427.13 per month and breaking down exactly how they're budgeting things. Like when you get that specific, you really feel it. So finding the new polar bear on this specific nexus of housing and environment, you know, might be one way to think about it. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So sort of building on that, there's Rachel asked, thank you so much, Rosanna. How are you connecting with environmental advocates outside of California? Sort of thinking about what is the community of reporting? As an East Coaster, I don't hear this message as clearly as we should. So do you go to meetings? Do you also talk to reporters? You just mentioned a reporter at the in Washington. So how much is there sort of sharing of stories, thinking about sort of how to be impactful at the national level?
Yeah, that's, you know, I mean, this is my personal opinion. So I think the LA Times has always I've always wondered, is it the smallest national newspaper or the biggest regional paper? Like we're definitely the big paper in California. We're the largest paper west of the Mississippi, but we are, and I think California is its own country, even not just like the LA Times, but just the way people think about California. And my beat, all of our environmental team is not under the national desk, it's under the California desk. So we're focused mostly on West Coast coverage. But definitely there is this robust conversation happening across reporters across the country. I was part of, so the Nieman Foundation at Harvard last year hosted this really cool summit of just bringing, I think, 40 environmental journalists from different parts of the world, you know, Miami and Seattle and me from Los Angeles and just like everywhere, and just kind of getting us all together and be like, we need to be more consistent in our messaging. The Guardian's calling it the climate crisis, and then, you know, this reporter here can't even use the words climate change because their editor edits it out all the time. You know, what are ways, you know, and some people feel like we still have to do the he said, she said, you know, some people think climate change is happening, and here is the other half of the story that says climate change might not be happening. Like, let's get past that. Let's get all these reporters up to speed on the current science. You know, here is some wording, especially for the smaller newsrooms that don't have as robust of an environment team or a science team. Like, here is some boilerplate language on how to explain global warming. So there are all these things that we're talking about as reporters. But with, you know, advocacy groups, I think I do feel like I am so stuck in California sometimes. And I think it's kind of the California mindset that, like, you know, as California goes, so goes the nation. And in some ways, like, yeah, that happens. Like if we pass something like all cars have to do this emission standard, I mean, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and car makers are going to have to change the way they make cars, you know, for everyone if they want. It's just going to be such a logistical nightmare to make cars specifically to hit California's emission standards and then do cars for the rest of the country. So I think in some ways it's like the policy happening in California is important, but is there more room to bridge these conversations elsewhere? Like, yeah, like at the Nieman Foundation last year, I heard from advocates based in Somerville that I had never talked to, or really had not come across kind of my constant feed of environmental activism. And I was like, I wish I had met these people sooner. So I think there's much more work to be done. I think in some ways with coronavirus and stay at home, like there's a lot more chatter happening on Twitter and social media, and a lot more kind of bridging of these silos. But that's another great silo that we need to be better at.
Thank you. Before I ask the next question, I just want to encourage students in the audience to post a question if you have one. So Andrew Kang writes, does the climate clock built in New York City do more harm or more good for the cause?
Ooh, I mean, what do you guys think? I struggle with time. I think I'm not fighting people. I'm not, like, fighting might not be the right word. I'm not having debates in California about whether climate change is happening. I'm having conversations and debates with people about how much time we have, and if this is a priority that needs to happen in this 2-year legislative session, or can we table it because coronavirus and figuring out wildfires is more important. Or talking to a homeowner who has a 30-year mortgage and just signed a 30-year mortgage and doesn't want to think about this until after they've resold their house or refinanced their house. So does the climate clock in New York help? I mean, it depends on how people are processing time, right? I also think, you know, there's similarly, there, like in San Francisco, for example, on one of the piers, they have these notches, like it's a public artwork thing on the pier where it shows you like the sea rises this much by this year, like the water will be here and it'll be here and it'll be here. Sometimes during high tide or king tides, it's the whole pier is underwater. But other times if you're going there during low tide, it's so far away that you're like, I don't have to think about this, not in my lifetime, maybe not even my grandchildren. So I think our sense of time gets compressed and stretched. And but I think if people are talking about it and if enough people are out there framing it and doing hot takes on it, I think that as long as it's like a conversation that is moving things forward like that, I definitely think, you know, awareness campaigns and awareness things like that is effective. But I just, as long as it's not directing the conversation in the wrong direction.
Time is such an issue because we have a real challenge. I mean, shifting baselines is something that all of us remember the recent and we don't remember the past. And so you're doing us all a service by wrestling with time and trying to get us to think about when something is urgent or not, and maybe letting us try to decide on that urgency. I think it sounds like what you're trying to do is to not be, we have to do it in the next 2 years. You decide if we have to do it in the next 2 years. Is that your approach? You, the reader.
Yeah, and I have to, yeah, and also shifting baselines just made me think, John Sutter, he used to be the climate correspondent at CNN, just is starting a project called Baseline that I encourage you all to check out. But he has chosen 4 locations: Miami, the Marshall Islands, somewhere in Alaska, fourth place, committed to doing a 50-year project. He's going to go back to the same town every 5 years until 2050, and like for 50 years. And he's going to do a documentary every 5 years just to make sure we do not forget, you know, what normal was back then, because we do readjust our baseline. But I'm just saying it's very hard for any reporter to commit to, I mean, he's committing to like, can you imagine committing to a thesis or a research project right now that you know you're still going to be doing from 30 years from now, 50 years from now? But I think it's important to, yeah, like it's just, I think time, the way we think about time, the way we prioritize issues is really hard. So I'm so in awe of what John is doing with this project. But I think the problem with politics too is like we operate on 4-year terms, maybe 8 years if you're reelected, and there're just like so many issues that are competing for interest. And like something like, okay, the city might be underwater 60 years from now is just not as like sexy of an issue as like building this bridge or whatever that is going to get the community more jazzed up in the short term.
Thank you. So William Burgess writes, could you elaborate on the fracking issue in California a bit more and the forces behind each side and of the debate?
I don't want to punt on this question, but as like the not energy oil reporter, I don't know. I feel like I can't get into the specifics of it, but I will definitely say it's a very hot issue in California. There have been calls for a really long time to just ban fracking, but you know, oil is also a huge resource and really bolsters our economy in California more so than we'd like to say. And with with Gavin Newsom, the governor's announcement yesterday, basically, if I understood it correctly, and I wasn't the reporter covering the news announcement yesterday, one of my colleagues was, but basically he punted to, he acknowledged that it's a demand that, you know, a lot of people have asking for. He acknowledged kind of the issue, and he has made statements now that fossil fuels are part of the problem. And he basically, with fracking, directed the legislature to propose a bill that would end fracking eventually. So, you know, he didn't do an executive order. He kind of told the legislature to look into it and to come up with something that then everyone can vote on. So again, let's talk about time. Like it just became another, it's going to take at least a couple more years to kind of get to that point where it's going to be voted on.
So check out the energy reporter at the LA Times. Undoubtedly, he or she has done some amazing reporting around this issue. I don't remember the person's name.
Sammy Roth, and SAMMYROTH, and he also does a newsletter to answer Rachel's question too. So we realized as we were looking at newsletters from news sources on environmental coverage that there was a hole in kind of all things environment on the West Coast and on the West. So he does a newsletter that comes out every Thursday called Boiling Point that summarizes California environmental coverage, stuff in Arizona, Colorado. So basically like all things on the West for environment. So that might be also another way to kind of be more plugged into what's going on with West Coast coverage.
So we have a question here from Bizay Banja. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you so much for your time. 2 questions. What was your favorite class at Tufts? And with all kinds of news available all the time, how do you decide which topics to talk, should be talked about more than others?
Oh my God, what was my favorite class at Tufts? That is such a loaded question.
Who do you want to make feel really good today?
I also have a list of classes that I wish I took at Tufts but never was able to because of my scheduling. I would say Media and Society by Sarah Soberai. I hope that class is still being taught. I think it was called Soch 40 back when I was at Tufts.
Still is.
Really great, just overview crash course on the media machine and communication. So that was a really excellent class. And then is Stephen Bailey still teaching? He's in the anthropology department.
No, he's not.
I don't, so all of my, like I kind of stumbled into biological anthropology for a science credit, but food, nutrition, and culture, and there was a couple biological anthropology stories, but the idea, I think anthropology is just, as an 18-year-old, I didn't realize how much of it was about, culture and unpacking communities and interviewing, right? So it was just that I think anthro is something that is a field that I am fascinated by, and I loved every anthropology class I took.
Great advice. And so how do you decide what should be talked about more than others? It's the second part of that question.
So, I have journalism students asking me in California, what is the hardest part of my job? And honestly, the hardest part of my job is figuring out what to say no to. I wish I had so much more time and so many more bodies to do these stories. And yeah, I am so conscious of the fact that for every story that I say yes to, I am neglecting for every endangered species that I choose to write about, it means that there are, 12 others where there's really interesting research or important movement happening on these animals that I am unable to get to, or a policy happening in Sacramento. But it's just recognizing too that if I spread myself across 12 issues, I'm not going to be able to deep dive into any of them like if I was able to just go into one and just really meet the people, talk to the communities, unpack motives and values, and really tell the story and spend the time reading all of the documents and the research. With the Sea Level Rise Project, it was consciously choosing to ignore my journalism reaction of there's controversy and a really interesting debate brewing in this city, the city, and this city. Let me write quick news stories out of all three, versus let me step back, spend a year collecting kind of the string of all these communities and figuring out how to do a story that dives into the overall issue more deeply. But yeah, I think at this point, it's figuring out the difference between an issue that is so hyper local, if it's a really hyper local issue, like a battle over water, the future of water in a very small town that most people will never end up visiting. What does this water battle say that other people can learn from, or what stakes or precedents will be set if this battle goes a certain direction? So I will ask those questions. If it doesn't check all those boxes, then maybe I'm just going to have to hope that a local regional reporter or the city reporter there will write that story. And that's why, like, you know, I'm so glad there are people here interested in environmental journalism, because there's too many important stories that get untold because we just don't have the ability to choose and tackle all of them.
If you take a back of an envelope calculation, when you say yes, how many hours are you committing to trying to really do the investigative reporting that you hold yourself to in terms of talking to people, going to place?
It really depends. So that sea level rise project took almost a year of reporting, and you know, throughout the reporting, it was like, you know, I would start writing and realize I needed more reporting, and also just like synthesizing a real thesis and like point that I was trying to make. And then, you know, spending the time to build a video game and figuring out how to, once I heard from all these people, like how do I translate them back into abstract choices that, you know, speak to a real truth that helps convey a point. Like that all took time. So those projects are, you know, at least a year in terms of it taking it to make. And then, you know, I personally think like a good beat journalist is always working on a long-term story, like a long-term story, like the Sea Level Rise project, working on one or two kind of deeper enterprise stories that's going to take about a month or two to really unpack, and then constantly juggling, at least at any point, a news daily. So a story that, you know, is breaking today, or will take 2 or 3 days to write and just crank out, because those are the ways you continue to be on top of what's going on. Those are the ways you are constantly talking to more people in your world, and like collecting your like meeting people who will be good sources in the future, or learning about an issue that you didn't realize was interesting until you spent 2 or 3 days writing the breaking news piece about it. You know, I have learned a lot about yeah, like I think you know, and then like there are kind of press release type stories that I've done where I, you know, actually responded to the press release, talked to the lead advocate or scientist on this issue, and as we're talking, there's like a deeper story out there. So I'll crank out the like 400-word story and then be like, okay, let's talk more. Let's figure out, let me join you on your dive boat next week and actually like spend some time with you, or like, oh, you're really interesting, I want to do a profile on you. So I think they're like keeping that in the mix too, like not being just a projects reporter, capital P, and forgetting to stay in touch with the communities that you cover is really important.
Well, Rosanna Xia, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to hear about your work and to share your stories. And I look forward to staying in contact in the future. Thank you so much
Yeah,
today.
great questions today. Thanks, guys.
So goodbye, everybody.